The issue of gambling evokes emotional debates. In the just completed legislative session, Florida lawmakers considered whether to expand or shrink casino gambling, or simply maintain the status quo. But they weren't able to agree on a gaming bill or a compact with the Seminole tribe. Join us as two Central Floridians discuss the pros and cons of expanding gaming in our state. Next on Metro Center Outlook. Hello, I'm Diane Trees. When it comes to gambling, the debate often includes discussions of economic impact, state revenues, and Florida's family-friendly image. Joining us now is Paul Sego. He's Executive Director of No Casinos, an advocacy group that opposes the expansion of casino gambling in Florida. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
No Casinos can trace its origin back to the 70s. What's the mission of the organization?
You're right. We were formed in 1978 by then Governor Ruben Askew because a constitutional amendment was put on the ballot to bring casino gambling to Florida. And Governor Askew realized that this was not the right social and economic policy for Florida. So he took it upon himself to travel the state and gather business leaders and convince them, and ultimately Florida voters, the same thing. And our mission is to fight the expansion of gambling because we have the same mission, because expanding gambling is the wrong social and economic policy for Florida.
That's what I wanted to clarify. Is it No Casinos opposing gambling in general, or more the expansion of gambling?
It's the expansion of gambling.
Or is that has evolved as we've gone along?
Right, and it has happened through fits and starts and the attempt by constitutional amendment and otherwise to bring gambling to Florida. But immediately after it was legalized in Atlantic City, they tried for Florida, and Governor Askew was successful, and then ballot initiatives were brought in 86, 94, and the slot machine amendment in 2004.
There's a lot of different aspects to gambling and gaming, and we'll get into a little more of that. Paul, one thing I was reading, to date, No Casinos has not disclosed who backers are or your financial supporters. Why not disclose that?
We're a lobbying organization, the same kind as hundreds of other groups that lobby in Tallahassee and other capitals, groups that your viewers are probably familiar with, maybe even donate to, on all sides of the political spectrum. Groups like the NRA, the AARP, League of Women Voters, all to my knowledge don't disclose their donors. When we lobby, we go up against some pretty serious opposition, and there's real opportunities for retribution against donors, and so that's why we don't disclose our donors. But the most important thing that I want viewers to understand about our donors is two things. First, we have hundreds of donors, most of which are small $5 and $10 donors because they agree with our philosophy that expanding gambling is the wrong social and economic policy. And two, we don't accept gambling money. And you may say, well, yeah, that's kind of a no-brainer, but in other states, that's not always the case. In some places, the No Casinos group or the No Gambling group is a front for the first casino to prevent the second casino from coming to town. And it's been in our bylaw since 1978 not to accept gambling money. We never have and we never will.
Paul, let's talk a little bit about where we are right now.
Sure.
The state legislature did not ratify the proposed agreement that Governor Scott had made with the Seminole tribe.
Right.
They didn't pass any gaming legislation. So now the Supreme Court is poised to make some decisions.
Yes.
How significant is it that the Supreme Court is now going to be making choices for us?
Well, we have a philosophy rooted in a strict interpretation of Article 10, Section 7 of the state constitution, and it says that lotteries, and lottery has been declared to mean all games of chance. So it says lotteries, except the kinds of pari-mutuel pools in existence in 1968 at the time of the Constitution passage, were prohibited. And we think that's the bright line. And to expand gambling, therefore, requires a vote of all the Floridians, right? And all the other gambling amendments were an attempt to amend that portion of the state's constitution. So 78, 86, 94 with the casino amendments were all an attempt to amend that article and section. The 2004 slots amendment did the same thing. The lottery in 1986, all were attempts to amend that portion of the Constitution. And so that had been prevailing wisdom in the state since the 60s, that if you're going to expand gambling, it requires a constitutional amendment voted on by all Florida voters. It's only been in the last couple of years that there's been some murky case law that says that the legislature has this authority to do so. And so we think that it's important to establish that bright line in the Constitution. So there's a case now pending before the state Supreme Court. Oral arguments are June 7th. We've put in a friend of the court brief laying out the constitutional argument. Former Senator and Governor Bob Graham has filed a similar brief. And he goes so far as to lay out he was in the legislature at the time, and to lay out the intent of what they meant when they passed that Constitution. So we feel that court decision really could establish that bright line that we think has been the prevailing wisdom for years.
Can you briefly outline what options might come as rulings from the Supreme Court,
Sure,
and what they might mean to us?
Sure. There are three possible outcomes of this court case. The first is that the court could rule in our favor, the one that we lay out in our friend of the court brief and Governor Graham does. And that is that it's the Constitution that is the ultimate authority. And therefore, if you want to expand gambling, it requires a vote of the people to amend the Constitution. That's option one. Option two is the court could rule more narrowly on the statute in question, and that would agree with the Attorney General's reading. That would agree with the First District Court that found that particular statute does not give these counties the right to install slot machines. So that's option two. Option three is they find for Gretna and say that they can get slot machines. And that would be the worst ruling from our standpoint.
That would certainly open up a whole different set of parameters.
It would, and it would launch our constitutional amendment that we are supporting, the Voters in Charge amendment, that has gotten 10% of the signatures required and is now before Supreme Court review and has been looked at by the Fiscal Impact Conference. And that would be an amendment that if the court returns a verdict in favor of Gretna or a more narrow decision, we would go forward with the amendment.
I knew that you had a proposed constitutional amendment up, and I didn't understand why you would do that without having the court ruling in place. And that amendment then is to give voters more of a control over gambling?
Correct, and we hope to not have to do it. If the court rules in the way our friend of the court brief lays out and Governor Graham and says that it's the Constitution as the ultimate authority, then we don't have to go forward with the amendment. But we feel strongly that it ought to be Florida voters that have the ultimate say in this, and that's what our amendment does. It returns authority to Florida voters to approve expansion of gambling.
Paul, let's go back to fundamentals here. Sure. Why is No Casinos opposed to gambling?
Sure. We're opposed to the expansion of gambling because we said it's the wrong social and economic policy. And you talked a little bit about Florida's brand. And our family-friendly brand is something we've, as a state, have invested billions of dollars in. And it's working. We attracted a record over 100 million tourists last year. You look at the Atlantic City brand, the Las Vegas brand. That brand and our brand are mutually exclusive. Vegas tried to be family-friendly in the 90s. It failed miserably. So they went back to that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And we've put so much into our brand, and it's working, and it's the envy of everyone in the country. And so why would we trade what works for what doesn't? We know that casino gambling, you can look at Atlantic City and some other options and see the real effect and damage that casinos cause when it comes to town.
Let's talk a little bit about the economic impact. Sure. Right or wrong, good or bad, what is the direct and indirect jobs that are created with the industry that's already here? How would that impact us economically if things would change?
Sure. Everywhere that casino gambling comes to an established economy, casinos close the businesses around it. And so if you think of that model, the model of a casino is go in, spend all your time and money, and only leave when you're broke. And it doesn't support businesses around it. You look at Atlantic City. In the years after casinos came to Atlantic City, 40% of restaurants and about a third of the local businesses closed down. You look at Queens, New York, that has installed slot machines in one of their racetracks. There was an article in the New York Times that talks about how the businesses around it now can't stay in business. It's changed the character of the neighborhood. You look at places like Columbus, Ohio, and Quad Cities, Iowa, that the failed promise of economic development that comes with casinos, it's happening everywhere. That model does not support local businesses around it.
Paul, I don't know the answer to this, but with no casinos, do you have a position about ratifying a renewed or even a changed compact with the Seminole Tribe, since we already had one in place?
We do. The 2010 compact, the one that we currently operate under, was sold to Floridians as a firewall against the expansion of gambling. And it's a firewall for a couple reasons. First, it really limits gambling to tribal properties. And there's real penalties for the state in terms of lost revenue if the state were to approve any other forms of gambling while under the compact. And so it's functioned in that regard. There's been no expansions since the 2010 compact, and it's worked. So if there were a straight renewal of what exists today, we wouldn't oppose it. But the compact that the governor signed at the end of 2015 is not a firewall. It expands gambling on and off tribal properties, bringing new slot machine facilities to places in South Florida, and expansion of gambling on tribal properties. And that's why we opposed it.
Okay. What would you most want our viewers to remember or to know about Florida and issues with gambling? Sure.
I think the most important thing is that our family-friendly brand is working. It's what we've put so much money behind. And this false promise from gambling that somehow it creates jobs and is stable, it's just not true. It's been proven not to be true in Atlantic City and other places. And so we have the brand that is the envy of the nation, and there's just no reason for us to trade a brand that's working for a brand that's not.
Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good to see you.
When we return, we'll be joined by a gaming industry professional. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Joining us now is Milton Champion III. He's a consultant to the gaming industry with 29 years experience in the business. Milt, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're the spokesperson for the Florida Gaming Association, and you're also a Florida licensed gaming and regulatory professional. What does this mean? What services do you provide?
Well, regulatory services, helping out other gaming commissions, other states, other countries. And then I also do casino development, internal controls, training. I provide professional testimony. I've done several cases providing that type of testimony, and training as well. So.
And you've worked with Florida for 10 years or so now, would you say, of the 29 years of experience that you have?
Well, I was in the actual gaming industry. I was part of the opening of 5 casinos while I was in the casino industry, and then I kind of went to the other side of the hallway and became a regulator in 2006. I was the initial chief of slot operations down in South Florida when we administered and installed the slot machines into Broward and Miami-Dade. And then I became the director in 2010. I was there for a year and a half, so I have about 5.5 years with the state of Florida.
Now, the gaming industry in Florida seems to be evolving around the compact with the Seminole Tribe. How did the compact come about in the first place?
Well, the compact initially, the Seminole Tribe and many tribes throughout the United States are able to have, under the National Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, they're allowed to have Class II machines. And machines, while we won't get into the technicality of things today, once a Class III machine, which is the ultimate slot machine, is offered in a state, then the Seminole tribe or the tribes are permitted to have those Class III, but they have to enter into a compact with the state. And so when Class III slot machines were were installed in Miami-Dade and Broward, that gave the Seminole Tribe the ability to enter into a compact with the state of Florida. And so the So they entered into this compact, and with the compact now, there's supposed to be some type of exclusivity, something that they would have that maybe others wouldn't. And so initially, when the first compact was introduced with Governor Christ, the exclusivity at that point, or at that time, was bank card games. And people were familiar with blackjack as a bank card game. And so the other power mutuals or the other businesses of gambling were not permitted to have the bank card games. Then when the bank card games, when the stipulation after 5 years of the initial compact came, they would renegotiate the bank card game portion. And so what they did was they renegotiated it, and in that renegotiation with the current governor, Governor Scott, they added in the craps and roulette. So pretty much making the Seminole Tribe casinos would be actually full casinos.
Now, the agreement by Governor Scott, that was not ratified by the legislature this time. But why is the tribe, it's an unprecedented amount of money for more than any tribe or any agreement to date. Why are they willing to increase that amount? It's a guaranteed payout to the state.
Well, I think a lot of the compact has been brought upon by other compacts from other states. And I think that the Florida legislature, at least from this last legislative session, is finally realizing that they don't have to go with the status quo. And so while there's a stipulation in there about exclusivity, there's also been some limitations assessed in the current compact. And examples of that would be like allowing Broward and Miami-Dade to have bank card games like blackjack, but there were stipulations that they couldn't have tables with any more than a $5 limit or a $25 limit. And quite frankly, I can remember when the Seminole Tribe started with bank card games, they had $50 limits. And so there were some stipulations that were placed on the other businesses. And so while it was supposed to be part of exclusivity, I think what we're finding out in the legislatures are understanding is that realistically it's more of a monopoly now.
Well, let's talk about then, since there was no gaming legislation passed in this legislative session, the Supreme Court now is poised to rule about possibly introducing some slot machines to parimutuel facilities in 6 counties around Florida that have previously passed a referendum. How much will this affect? What's the best ruling? What's fair?
Well, I think what people have to or should understand is that the slot referendums, first and foremost, were spread out throughout the state. So it's not like it was in one specific location like Miami-Dade and Broward did when they had their referendums. And so there's, 2 or 3 up in the up in the north and in the Panhandle. There's 1 or 2 in the south, and there was 1 in the kind of like Central Florida location. So these were actually spread out, and I think the biggest reason why the local referendums were passed is because these people are looking for jobs, and they know that the industry pays above average salaries. Okay, so that's really what they were looking for. And I think the other thing is that as a former director and having gone around to the different parimutuel facilities, I found that you probably won't see too many people driving from Central Florida or from the Panhandle to Miami-Dade or to Broward. In fact, I would almost guarantee that if you took a ride over to Biloxi on the weekends, you'll find the majority of the people, or you'll find a lot of Florida tags over there, because people up in the Panhandle, in fact, to get a full casino environment, they're driving to Biloxi or to Alabama. And so that's one of the things we looked at.
Now, you were talking about these counties being spread out around the state. There's some concern that tourism leaders here in Central Florida have expressed if gambling would be expanded, their concern is that gambling creep would then come into the Central Florida area. Can you tell us briefly what gambling creep is, and is this a viable concern?
Well, I think gambling creep over the years has been a media description, and it's probably very well because in the last 3 years now, they tried to pass a very large encompassing gambling bill of as much as 300 pages. And so when you have that sort of thing, there's just too many entities that are involved. And then you get your special interest, of which I could give numerous descriptions, but the large gaming bills just haven't really had a chance. And Florida, you know, the Chapter 550, which is the pari-mutuel chapter in Florida, it's been over years, it's been piecemealed. And I think that's what they're referring to with the gambling creep, because, you know, special interests come in or there's things that have been done piecemeal rather than doing all-encompassing. So I think it's a real hard thing to try to get everybody together, get everybody happy, and make it work. So that's the biggest problem that I see that they've had in the last few years.
Well, Central Florida has worked very hard to cultivate a family-friendly travel destination image, and I think that's some of the concern. Do you think that expanding gambling in the state jeopardizes that image for us in this region?
Well, I think that's kind of twofold. There's a lot of people that, and I've worked in other states. I've opened 5 casinos or been a part of the opening of 5 casinos in other states. And many of my friends that come in from those states or visit, or even relatives for that matter, when they come in, very seldom do they ask where the closest casino is. They come down, they want to go to the amusement parks, they want to go to the beaches and that sort of thing, because after all, the majority of the states in the United States now have gambling, some form of gambling. And so it's already there. It's a part of their home where they're at. The other thing that should be looked at too, there's talk about a statewide vote, and sometimes you want to be a little cautious about what you wish for, because a lot of the retirees that are coming down from the northern states, Midwestern states, and all, they have gambling. They're acceptable to the idea. So when they come down to Florida and they retire, you know, if they go to a casino or to a pari-mutuel, then they want to be able to play what they've played up in the north. And let's face it, I think the last time I checked, the state of Florida was number 4 in revenue for the state, and so that's huge. And you have the pari-mutuels. I mean, you can go in right now. You can bet on a race. You can bet on a simulcast. You can play poker.
Milt, what would you most want viewers to know or to remember about Florida and issues with gambling?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and it was nice because FDLE put out a report just a couple years ago that the fact is the crime has not increased in South Florida, and not in Miami-Dade or Broward as a result of that. And you know, gaming provides jobs. It provides above salary jobs. Any casino or gaming facility that I've worked for was always involved in the community. And I'm not talking about just monetary wise. I'm talking about, you know, community effort, service, people putting in their time to the community. And I think at the end of the day, they're going to find that these that the casinos would be an asset. Now, let's face it, if people are in a certain area and they can't find jobs, they're not going to local businesses, they're not going to the restaurants, they're not going to certain places. So these things, when you're able to employ people, that helps other businesses in the area.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That's our show for today. Join us next week when we again explore issues important to Central Florida. Thanks for watching. I'm Diane Trees.